Hello and welcome to another episode of the Health Notebook. Today we're discussing travel health issues and we have Dr. Parker in the studio. Dr. Parker, welcome to another episode of the Health Notebook.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here, and thank you again once again for the invitation. It's always nice to spread the word of travel and how to go about traveling, as well as some information about the medical side of it.
Okay. Dr. Parker, can you maybe inform the viewers a little bit about yourself, where you've come from, what are you doing currently?
Okay, pure and proper Cape Townian, born and bred in the Cape Flats, always will be one of the members of this particular society here. You don't want to hear me start speaking Afrikaans because then you'll hear where I come from. But basically, Cape Town bred and born, went to UCT to do my medical studies. After that, I became quite interested in travel medicine. Did a course called the Certificate of Competence in Travel Medicine, which is based here at the University of Witwatersrand about 10 years ago. And because I've always had a big interest in Hajj travel, I actually got co-opted into the executive of the South African Society of Travel Medicine, which is called SASTM. And alhamdulillah, over the last few years, because we've done a bit of research, I've been elected the president of the South African Society of Travel Medicine.
That's excellent. What I've also noticed is that you've published a number of articles. Can you maybe just highlight some of the publications that you've published so far?
Yeah, I initially started writing what some of my friends called Skinner stories, or gossip stories, about my experiences on Hajj. It was termed the Hajj stories. It was in Muslim Views for about 15 consecutive years without any break in between. But because there's been a larger demand for these stories, I've decided to put it onto my website, which is www.hajjdoctor, very easy, .co.za, and there's a monthly story published in there. So those are the social stories that I write. I've also written a series about Medina, because really I did say Cape Town is home, but Medina is my proper home, and I've always had this feeling of love and peace and serenity whenever I was there and whenever I go there. So I've written a series of about 60 articles, which was also published in Muslim Views over a period of 5 years, and the intention is to put it into book form one day.
And you're also known as the Hajj Doctor. Can you just tell us where was that term coined?
Yes, my first year, and I'll never forget this incident. I was in Medina, as of all places, and one of the imams, Imam Pandi, who was the Imam of Mowbray Mosque, noticed me walking along the passage, and he looked at me and he said, "Don't I know you from somewhere?" I said, "Yes, Imam, I always go to your mosque on a Friday," because I was at that time a student at UCT, which was very close to Mowbray Mosque. I said, "Just come and have a look at this gentleman here. I know you're a doctor. Just come and have a look at this gentleman who was quite sick." I did, and then there were a few other people who were sick. This was in 2000, the year 2000. And it followed that during that particular year, during Hajj, I was called upon as a doctor to quite a lot of people. Interested me to find the diverse nature and the diverse medical conditions that people had during that year. And it became a medical and a spiritual and a social issue for me as far as people getting ready for Hajj is concerned. And since that year, I've been virtually every year except for 1 year.
Okay, so you've been going every single year since 2000?
1 year I missed out, but that year there were two Hajjs. It was 2006. Hajj was in December as well as in January, because remember Hajj follows the lunar calendar, which becomes 10 days, which is 10 days shorter than the Gregorian one. So that particular year there were two Hajjs, and I only could go once that year.
Okay, so it's Hajj season is around the corner. Now I received the notification. I'm one of the accredited members to go for Hajj. Can you just walk through the initial steps in terms of health? What should I do?
Okay, firstly, as I mentioned before, Hajj becomes 10 days earlier every year. So this year, 2016, Hajj is going to be in September, which is one of the hottest times of the year in Saudi Arabia. We're looking at temperatures nothing less than 45 degrees every day on average During the 5 days of Hajj, it might even go up to 50 degrees. And last year, for example, it reached 51 degrees on the peak day of Hajj, which is Arafah. So people should be aware that they're going to be experiencing extremely hot temperatures. And there's only one thing that you can really advise people about combating the high temperatures, and that is to acclimatize as much as possible. So my first piece of advice is, if you've been accredited, go for the longest period that you can afford and that your work will obviously allow you to do. So if you can go for 6 weeks, go for that package. You can go for 7 weeks, which very few people can actually go for. But if you can, go for the longest period possible. That allows your body to acclimatize. There's nothing better than that.
When you mean acclimatize, what do you actually mean? Do you mean being fit, or what do you actually mean?
Okay, there's two components to that. The one is that your body becomes used to the temperature, and it takes a period of time. If I, for example, go from the Cape Town weather at the moment, which is maximum about 20 degrees, straight to Saudi Arabia, I'm going to have physiological changes in my body, which is difficult to adapt, and there's a chance of me getting quite a few problems. One is heat stroke, which is extreme but quite rare, and which can be fatal.
And that would be something similar to a normal stroke, which will cause impaired speech, slurredness.
But the problem with heat stroke is that it's got a very high mortality. The chances of passing away from it is quite high. The chances of having long-term side effects, like you've mentioned, impaired speech and so forth, permanently, in other words, you're talking permanent damage, is also quite high. So that is one extreme event that we try to avoid at all costs. Luckily, it is quite rare, but it is one of those preventable issues that we always like discussing. Then you have heat exposure, where people just get a bit of sun. It feels like you've had a good tan, but you're dehydrated, you feel extremely lethargic, but you are not as severely sick as the heat stroke.
So that would be in terms of heat exhaustion.
Heat exhaustion is another term that we use for it as well. And again, the longer you're in a place where you can be exposed to such high temperatures, the better your body acclimatizes towards it. So that is the first thing that we tell people is to try to go for as long as you can go. Second issue that I always address to people is, like you've mentioned, get fit. Hajj is spiritual. Hajj is unique in that it is emotional, and it is a very, very community-based event. But Hajj is predominantly physical. The 5 days of Hajj especially, transport is at times congested. Transport is at times really, really tight. But most of the times it's virtually impossible. It takes me faster to walk 10 kilometers, for example, from a place called Arafat to Mina, than it takes a bus, which can take up to 22 hours.
Okay.
And it can take me 2 hours to do the same.
So besides being fit, one also needs to ensure that there is adequate amount of fluids. That would mean in terms of water.
If you carry it with you, yes. When I'm referring to being fit, I'm referring to having a fitness program starting today.
So if I know I'm going in September, I need to start today.
And what we always say is you must try to walk as a matter of general exercise, because Hajj is mostly walking. Running and so forth doesn't really add much benefit to it. And what we normally advise people is to walk at a pace where you are where you're walking fast enough for you not to have a long conversation with someone walking with you. So if you are able to have a walk and you can have a nice chat to someone next to walking with you, you're not walking fast enough. Up the pace.
Okay. As we know, Hajj is one of the five pillars of Islam. What are the conditions around that?
Okay, there's a couple of conditions, and the first one is that you must be healthy enough. And again, there's a bit of a paradox here, because a lot of our people, especially in Cape Town, save for years to go on Hajj. They might even save for decades. I mean, we know of people who've had to save for 50 years. I had a gentleman recently who saved for about 30 years. Then his child had to go to university, so he used that money to send the child to university. He saved another 5 years. Then there was a calamity in the family where there was a house broken into, badly damaged, the house wasn't insured. So he used that Hajj money again. So by the time he was financially sound, his health wasn't financial, his health wasn't sound. And he was close to 80 years old. And it's one of those difficult situations where you want to tell someone, look, you're not really fit enough to endure the rigors of Hajj. But how do you deny someone like that the opportunity to perform Hajj? And the Saudis take cognizance of this fact. I mean, the medical facilities that they provide in Saudi Arabia is really world class. We've had patients who had a heart attack at 2 o'clock in the morning, and by 6 o'clock they had stents put in and they were out of ICU already. Last year, for example, they performed over 2,000 kidney dialysis procedures, a couple of hundreds of of stent operations, and what we call angiographies to see whether people's arteries going to the hearts are blocked. So they've got good facilities there. And what I always advise people is that if you are fit enough to endure the travel from South Africa to Saudi Arabia, in other words, if you can endure the plane journey, and if you have good enough support, if you're wheelchair bound, for example, and you have a good group of people with you who can assist you, then you should be able to travel.
As you've just mentioned, there may be individuals that have certain medical conditions. Now, I know September is a little bit further down the line. I've got an existing medical condition. What should I do to optimize myself to make sure that I am ready for that particular day?
Now, most pilgrims, if they have chronic medical conditions like high blood pressure, like diabetes, asthma is another common one that I refer to. These are people who probably have one doctor and have had the same doctor for the last 10 years. And yes, it sounds like I'm punting for business now, but it's a good idea to go see your GP, because he will know what your medical conditions are. If you belong to a club, for example, a diabetic club at a day hospital, go see the nursing sister there, go see the doctor who sees you on a regular basis. Tell them that you're planning to go for Hajj and that and they will advise you to now already to optimize your medical conditions. I always say that, if you have a medical condition and you really want to go for Hajj, the Creator gave the exemption of it not being compulsory as a mercy. But if the love for the journey is there and if the willingness is there, I don't think people should be stopped within reason. I mean, and the example that I can quote is of a lady a couple of years ago who had breast cancer, an aggressive form, but she insisted on going for Hajj. And Hajj was about 3 months away, and she did not want to start chemotherapy and radiotherapy, because by that time she would have been really sick by the time Hajj came. And there we use the premise of life is more important than health, and it's more important than rituals. We got the priest in, the imam, and we also got the doctors in, and we got SAUC, the South African Hajj and Umrah Council, in to explain to her that she will be first in line the next year if she had to postpone that particular year. Took a lot of convincing, took a lot of interaction with her, but she finally understood that by undertaking the journey, she was probably shortening her life, probably would have passed away within a year, and would have, in effect, been the cause of her own death.
So it's about weighing up the advantages and disadvantages.
Absolutely. So she did have she underwent surgery, underwent chemo and radiotherapy, and a year later, when she went for Hajj, she said she endured three to 6 terrible months of medical afflictions because of radio and chemotherapy, but she had the most wonderful Hajj journey the year thereafter. Absolutely, and she still raves about the journey.
Okay, so we've spoken a little bit about the requirements, which means you need to actually get fit, which is number one. We've spoken a little bit about the health of the individual that the person needs to ensure. What about vaccinations? Where does vaccinations come into play?
Okay, certain vaccines are what we call absolute requirements. It's mandatory for travel to Saudi Arabia. The first one is the meningitis vaccine. And the reason for that is that in the year 2000 and 2001, there were episodes of meningitis outbreaks in Saudi Arabia during the Hajj period. So the Saudis made it compulsory for each Umrah as well as Hajj pilgrim to take the meningitis vaccine. Now there's two types of meningitis vaccines that you get. The one is what you call a conjugate vaccine, and I'm not going to elaborate on it, but it's basically a vaccine that protects you as a pilgrim. So if you're the pilgrim, you have the injection in you, you are protected, but the meningitis germ sits in your throat. It doesn't invade into your bloodstream. It doesn't go through your throat, through the lining of your lungs and so forth into your body, because the vaccine is protecting you. But it sits there. And if someone comes home, for example, and this happened in 2000 and 2001 as well, where returning pilgrims went to 14 different countries, and this includes Indonesia, England, France, the United States. Once they got home, they coughed this germ out. Remember, they protected, but their family members, their loved ones around them, and their neighbors and so forth were not. So they coughed it out. The neighbors and everyone else did not have the vaccine, and they actually got meningitis there. So that's why we advise people not to take this what we call the polysaccharide vaccine, but instead take something called the conjugate vaccine. Currently, it's the only one available in South Africa. It's quite expensive, but people will not have a choice in taking it, because the cheaper polysaccharide one, which is not fully effective, is not available currently in South Africa. Now, this conjugate vaccine actually kills a bug in your throat as well. So it protects the person, the pilgrim that's going for Hajj, but it also prevents him from bringing it back to his country like South Africa, coughing it out into the neighborhood and spreading an epidemic of the disease here.
Okay. What other vaccines? I mean, typhoid or and what about malaria?
The second one is yellow fever, which is currently for South Africans required to travel to Saudi Arabia. Now, a lot of our people will say there's no yellow fever in South Africa, which is true, and there's no yellow fever in Saudi Arabia, which is also true, but Saudi Arabia classifies South Africa as Africa other than Arab nations. So we fall in that broad category of countries, which includes Angola, in which there's currently a yellow fever epidemic. It also includes Nigeria. It also includes countries such as Ethiopia, through which a lot of our pilgrims travel through. So the Saudis are not interested about whether we're coming from South Africa. They're looking at Africa other than Arab countries.
They categorized us.
Exactly, as a yellow fever area. Now, and I don't blame them for that. And the reason is that the mosquito that actually that transmits yellow fever exists in Africa up to areas such as KwaZulu-Natal. It's actually found in our country as well. It's also found in Saudi Arabia. So if someone comes from Africa, whether with a forged yellow card or whether the yellow card is proof that you had the yellow fever vaccine. So if someone comes with a forged yellow card and actually has the disease after being bitten by a mosquito, they land in Saudi Arabia, come to Makkah, for example. The same mosquito that can transmit yellow fever exists in Makkah. It can bite that infected person and then spread it to the 3 million people there. So the Saudis are very strict about enforcing this yellow fever requirement, and this is what in travel parlance is called the yellow fever card, the yellow card.
So that is what and it needs to be stamped as well, but
stamped by a registered yellow fever practitioner.
Okay, and they obviously check that once you enter Saudi Arabia.
Sometimes they don't, and a lot of travelers will say, "No, I went 5 times to Saudi Arabia and it was never checked." 6th time you go and you're in a group of 100 people, for example, the whole group gets stopped because one person didn't have the card. So it's as if you, throughout the world, there's always a chance that no one's going to bother looking at your documentation. But the day they actually stop and look at it, you might be in trouble for not having the relevant documentation.
Okay, so you've spoken about the mosquito transmitting the one disease. What about malaria? I mean, people travel and they need to take malaria prophylaxis?
There's no malaria in Makkah, there's no malaria in Medina or in Jeddah, which is the places that the pilgrims go to. So malaria prophylaxis is not needed. Yes, we do see cases of malaria during Hajj time, but those are pilgrims who came with malaria. They either had the disease before they left their home country, such as Somalia, for example. We've had I know of 2 cases last year. One person from Nigeria came with malaria, but it wasn't acquired in Saudi Arabia. There was one unique case where a person was bitten, where a mosquito was transmitted and transported from a country. We actually don't know which country. Remember, mosquito can survive a few days, so it somehow got into the luggage or into the plane, or however it got from a particular country into Saudi Arabia, and then it actually bit someone in Saudi Arabia and caused that person to have malaria. That we call it Abyssinian malaria, but it's rare. It's fascinating for us as doctors, but it's nothing to worry about.
So, I mean, just to recap for the viewers' sake as well, we've touched on the physical fitness, we've touched on the health examination, we've touched on the vaccination. Now, I've completed my Hajj successfully, I've come home.
I just want to add that everyone should take the flu vaccine as well. Influenza is the commonest disease we see amongst pilgrims there. Remember, there's people from 184 countries all converging in one place. And yes, it's the northern hemispheres, it's going to be the northern hemispheres just after their summer. But in Saudi Arabia, influenza is throughout the year. It's not a winter disease like it is in our case. So we advise all our pilgrims to take the influenza vaccine.
Okay. Now going back to the question, once an individual comes back from Hajj, is it necessary to be aware of his health? Does he or she require an additional health examination?
Okay, yes, not an examination if they're well. An examination if they're unwell, and that is because of there's a disease currently circulating in Saudi Arabia called MERS, Middle Eastern Respiratory Distress, the Middle Eastern Respiratory Coronavirus disease. We think it's transmitted via camels to people. So if the one advice we tell all our pilgrims, especially this year, is not to go to the camel farms and try not to drink camel milk, because we think this particular virus is transmitted by camels, especially young camels. And the problem with this disease is that it spreads incredibly quickly, especially in hospitals. So it spreads from one person to another quite quickly, and about 40% of people who get this disease pass away. It's not very common. We haven't found it amongst pilgrims in Saudi Arabia. We haven't found it being spread to other countries. But to just give an example, there was one particular traveler who went to Saudi Arabia and he went back to Korea. And he caused the disease in 184 people, of which about 40%, of which 40% passed away. But just to screen and prevent it from spreading amongst that country's population meant that about 20,000 people had to be isolated and be monitored for a few weeks before the disease could be declared under control in that country.
So one should actually self-monitor themselves. Okay. Now, what we've been discussing is purely on Hajj, but the same framework can be applied on other travels outside the country as well. Is that correct? So you can follow the same format.
Yes, we always use what we call an algorithm. I mean, it is who's a traveler? Is that particular traveler? Does he have medical conditions? How young is he? How old is he? What is he physically capable of doing? What can he do? What can't he do? So we look at the person that's traveling. Then we look at also where they're going to. So we're talking to completely different scenarios if you're going to New York or if you're going to the Central African Republic. So then we're looking at what are they going to do there. There's a big difference going to India, living in a 5-star hotel, or going to the village in India and drinking from the same well as the locals there and getting bitten by mosquitoes that might be transmitting malaria.
Okay. So what it actually means then, it's what risk you pose to them and what risk that country poses to you, and that's how you come up with your health requirements.
Absolutely. And we also, it's a case of where they're going to, like I've mentioned, where they're going to live. But we also, as doctors, are aware that your inhibitions during travel somehow seems to be lessened. People take risks that they, under normal circumstances, would not. We know that. And We know we've talked of diseases quite extensively, but we must take into account that most causes of death in travelers is not disease, it's not malaria or any of those ones, it's accidents.
Okay.
So, and because people tend to take more risk, car accidents are more common. Deaths amongst travelers due to accidents, due to violence, for example, is more common than death due to disease, to infectious diseases. So we advise our pilgrims to use the same types of awareness of their circumstances. If they are advised not to go out at night because there's a lot of drunk people around, they should heed those type of advice.
Dr. Parker, it's been a pleasure having you in the studio. To sum up, what would be the most important take-home message for the viewers?
I always say travel is a big eye-opener, and my motto is travel as much as you can, but be prepared for each and everything. You might not find everything you want, you might not experience everything you want, but I assure you there will always be something that will stick in your heart, stick in your mind, and stick in your soul with each and every travel that you undertake.
Thank you once again. Thank you, viewers, for watching. Stay tuned for another episode of the Health Notebook next week, same time, same place.